So welcome back, everybody. We're going to be looking at a tiny bit of chapter 20 of the Dhammapada, and the subject, the main thrust of what we'll be talking about today, are what's called so the main thrust of what we're going to be talking about is the teaching of three marks of conditioned existence, what are known in Buddhist parlance as the three lakshanas. And these will be familiar to quite a few of us, maybe not very familiar to a few others. So I'm just going to briefly mention them before I carry on. So we have three marks of existence. The first one is impermanence, things change. The second one is that in conditioned existence, things aren't totally satisfactory. There is a sense of unsatisfactoriness to everything in conditioned existence. Dukkha is the term which is often used in the Buddhist world and throughout the world. And the third one is that things in conditioned existence don't have a fixed, eternal self-nature. Nothing is nothing we can find has a fixed self-nature. So those are the three marks of existence: lack of self-nature, impermanence, and dukkha, or suffering. So the three lakshanas go into a pub, and three lakshanas go into a pub. Oh. So that's a joke in itself, isn't it? Anyway, we'll carry on. So three lakshanas go into a pub, and it's a pretty dodgy and rather rough-looking pub. So that they go in, and the first lakshana looks around, and he says rather too loud, and he's, "God, this is a real dump, isn't it? Look at the miserable-looking customers, and there's an absolute mess on the floor. Look at the state of the walls." And so the atmosphere in the pub sort of goes downhill somewhat. And then the second lakshana says, "Oh, don't worry, we won't be here too long. We're just passing through." Then the third lakshana goes up to the meanest-looking guy supporting the bar and says, "Who do you think you are, looking at me like that?" Anyway, that's the who do you think you are, looking at me like that? So that's the third lakshana. That's the devoid of self lakshana, just in case you haven't twigged. Something's bang. Anyway, so we'll go from the ridiculous to the sublime, and we'll go to the text. I think that the punchline was the beginning. Three lakshanas go into the pub. Probably maybe I ought to just left it there. Everybody would have been happy. So this is chapter 20 of the Dhammapada. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with insight, one becomes weary of suffering. This is the way to purity. All conditioned things are painful. When one sees this with insight, one becomes weary of suffering. This is the way to purity. All things whatsoever are devoid of unchanging selfhood. When one sees this with insight, one becomes weary of suffering. This is the way to purity. So before we take a look at the particular lakshanas and what we might make of them, I'll just mention a story from my own life, which sort of highlights, particularly for me, the effect that lakshanas can have if we engage them, maybe inadvertently. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of lockdown, and I don't know about how you were affected by the first few days of lockdown. But anyway, there was this fear in me that basically we're all going to die. You didn't know what's going to happen. There's quite a lot of fear and anxiety around what was going on. We didn't know what was going to happen. So my response to that was to really launch very wholeheartedly into what ended up being a period of a month of quite intense meditation, which had a very, very strong and positive effect. And when I've been sort of reflecting on what might have been going on there. So we had the spectre of impermanence raised itself rather to the forefront of my mind and other people's mind. And also one thing which was particularly noticeable for me was that how things were taken away from us very rapidly. We couldn't do what we normally did. You couldn't go to the shops. You weren't even supposed to go outside very much. You couldn't go and visit your friends. So there's something that very fragile about life, which suddenly came very much to the fore. And life was, to some degree, or this unsatisfactoriness of life was just a bit more visible. So what seems to be happening, based on my reflections, is basically more in touch with impermanence and more in touch with a sense of unsatisfactoriness of life. And that seemed to have an incredibly positive effect on my ability to engage deeply in meditation. To use Sangharakshita's language, he talks about the light of reality. So I'm sort of thinking that being in touch with the Lakshanas in quite a visceral kind of way, there was more light of reality which is sort of coming through, which was very helpful for a deepened meditation practice. So that's just a start from my own experience, how the Lakshanas seem to be working through me in this particular case in a very, very positive way. So so maybe you need to go now into understanding what the Lakshanas mean, what they refer to. So basically, these are described as marks of conditioned existence. And this means conditioned existence with a conditioned mind. So this is our state of affairs, that with an unenlightened mind and unenlightened perception, these three lakshanas of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and lack of inherent selfhood, these are characteristics, you could say, of unenlightened perception in relation to things. So it's importantly, we're not really talking about the unsatisfactoriness or the impermanence of what is out there, outside of us. It's much more a relationship between the mind we have and what may be out there, but we don't know what's out there, because all we know is what we perceive. So it's really a characteristic of unenlightened perception of whatever may be there. So we can't really blame what's out there, but for the three lakshanas, it's more that it's a relationship between our consciousness and what may be out there, which we will never know. So so these are ideas. The lakshanas are concepts. So in terms of Buddhist thought, that they are relative, not absolute truth. They're pointing at absolute truth, but they aren't absolute truth in and of themselves, but they're incredibly powerful. They're very useful teachings to take us deeper, to head us in the direction of reality. So although they are concepts, they are very deep, and we might start off with a conceptual assent. Yeah, they sound sort of right, but we need to go way deeper than that. We need to understand the lakshanas at levels way deeper than the intellectual. And to use Sangharakshita's language, he talks about gaining emotional equivalence of our intellectual understanding. That's emotional equivalence of our intellectual understanding. So that's going deeper than the purely intellectual in our understanding. And this requires deep reflection. and discussion to go deeper. And these teachings are very deep and profound, and the Buddhist tradition has it that the meditation on these teachings lead to what are called 3 samadhis, as kind of meditative states, gateways to liberation, and the term in Pali is the vimoksha mukkhas. So these are where meditation and reflection on the lakshanas can lead. They can lead to these vimoksha mukkhas, and from there profound insight may arise. So they're very deep, and it says in the Dhammapada that they're the path, they're the way to purity. So in a way, it's suggesting that they can probably take you all the way, particularly if you back up one's practice with ethics and meditational practice. This is a wisdom practice, you could say. These lakshanas are sort of Buddhist wisdom, which can lead to profound insight. So in connection to these lakshanas, the Buddhist tradition talks about what are called, well, in translation, the topsy-turvy views. So for those who've been around some time, you might be familiar with the Pali asserts. So that's the Pali or Sanskrit for topsy-turvy views. So basically what's being said here is we've got the lakshanas and also one extra category, which can lead us in the direction of seeing things as they really are, but we generally see things the other way. We're attached to views which tend to see things the other way. So what the Vipariyasas say is that when you've got to the lakshana, for example, of impermanence, but the Vipariyasa version of that is, it says we tend to hold to views of seeing things as permanent. And with the lakshana of unsatisfactoriness, we have a tendency to see at least some things as being fully satisfactory. And with the lakshana of lack of inherent selfhood, the Vipariyasa version is seeing things as substantial rather than seeing them as insubstantial. We see them as having inherent self-nature. I mean, that's certainly not immediately obvious that we might hold to these kind of views, but when I was reflecting on my own experience, I remember when I was 7 years old, I suddenly twigged in the middle of the night that I was not immortal, and that was a big shock. So clearly up to that point, and it's sometimes said that young people tend to think they're going to live forever. And up to the age of 7, I definitely thought I was going to live forever. Not that I even thought in those terms, but when I sort of realized that was actually not the case, it was a big shock. So that was one indication that the Vipariyasas probably true. There's probably some truth in what the Vipariyasas is saying. And also when I was younger, and certainly up to soon after I started practicing Buddhism, sometimes I would contemplate the possibility that in our life that death is the end of everything, kind of a very nihilistic point of view, and that would plunge me into a bad mood for anything from 2 minutes to a week. So that really points out to me that around that time I was definitely clinging to the idea that I did indeed have inherent selfhood. There was something about me that was impervious to conditions, was immortal, and I had I had an inherent self. And when I contemplated the possibility that self was done away with at death, that created quite a strong degree of conflict in me. So anyway, those reflections led me to at least provisionally take on board that these Vipariyasas indeed do have some truth in them. They do point at something about how we tend to see the world. And you might like to reflect on in your own experience, is there anything which would seem to suggest that we have some buying into these vicariases, these topsy-turvy views, and that may give us a bit more fuel when it comes to meditating, reflecting on the Lakshanas. So now I'll just say a bit about each of the Lakshanas in turn. I don't want to talk for too long, so I want to have about 20 minutes just to go into groups to discuss these matters a little bit later. So looking at the first, well, I'll call the first one impermanence. It's normally stated as a first, but I don't quite know why that is. And Ryokan, the Japanese monk of, I think he was in the 1700s. He wrote a lot of really nice poetry, and one of his lines in one of his poetries was, "I'm going to tell you a secret. Everything is impermanent." So it's not exactly a really big secret, but it's interesting that he used that terminology. Although it's sort of known, he's telling you it's a secret. So he's really suggesting that there's more to this secret than you might have thought, that it's actually something really profound. And Abraham Lincoln, not a particularly well-known Buddhist, but he had this phrase which he used to use on occasions when maybe something difficult had happened, maybe he was grappling with some difficult emotions. He would tell himself, "This too will pass." It was quite a nice, simple way of engaging with the truth of impermanence. Now, impermanence, we might normally think of it as being a rather unpleasant thing. We will tend to think in terms of, oh, this means that things we like will pass away and relationships will end, people will die, etc., etc., going down the rather miserable route. That's probably how we might normally think of impermanence. But it has its upside as well, that things can change for the better. So engaging with the path of the Dharma, we're hoping to and putting efforts into to actually transform ourselves for the better. So without impermanence, we know Dharma life. So you wouldn't be here without impermanence. So we need to take on board sort of this bigger view of what impermanence means. It's not just all about the shady side of the street. It's more, well, it has this very much positive upside which we're engaging with when we practice the Dharma. So it's a theme which many poets have talked about over the centuries. And I'm going to read a verse from the Diamond Sutra. And when I first started to reflect on this theme, I think I suggested, how about watching in your mind's eye an autumn leaf just falling down slowly down to the ground. And for me, that worked. It was quite an appealing image, which just sort of spoke about the impermanence of nature, particularly. And I'm going to read this verse from the Diamond Sutra, which is the Diamond Sutra is a perfection of wisdom text of the Mahayana, and it's a well-known verse, familiar to quite a few of us, and it's as stars, a fault of vision, as a lamp, a mock show, dewdrops or a bubble, a dream, a lightning flash or cloud, so should one view what is conditioned. So I'll say that again. As stars, a fault of vision, as a lamp, a mock show, dewdrops or a bubble, a dream, a lightning flash or cloud, so should one view what is conditioned. So we've got a few images there which particularly talk about the impermanent nature of things. We've got dewdrops which sort of appear around dawn, and then by 9 o'clock or so they've gone. We've got a bubble which is very evanescent thing. It sort of just comes in and then very rapidly bursts. you've got a lightning flash, which is only lasts for a microsecond, and you've got a cloud, something that comes into being and then very rapidly goes out of being. So there's some nice images there which really talk about the impermanent nature of things. And the last thing I mentioned about impermanence is that it isn't fully real. And what I mean by that is that permanence requires the concept of time. Impermanence requires time as kind of a substrate, so things change in time. Now, Buddhism has it, and I think sometimes we might be able to intuit that time isn't actually a real construct. It's something which is fabricated. So at some level, impermanence isn't fully real, but it's something very profound, which is pointing in the right direction. So that's a bit about impermanence. And now I'll say a little bit about the lakshana of unsatisfactoriness or dukkha. So as well as being one of the marks of conditioned existence, dukkha is the first noble truth. So there is unsatisfactoriness in life. And the second noble truth is that the cause of this unsatisfactoriness is craving, and that sometimes aversion might be included in that. So craving is a necessary condition for the arising of a sense of unsatisfactoriness. And my understanding is that with an awakened person, this sense of unsatisfactoriness isn't fabricated. So it's a fabrication of the unenlightened mind. And the teaching from the Pali Canon, which we're familiar to some, maybe even most of us here, is a teaching of the two darts, which says we can't really avoid this first dart. Unpleasant things are bound to happen sooner or later. We can't completely avoid that first dart, but what we tend to do is take another one for good measure and put it in. So that's the one we can avoid. So it's, in a way, we could say, don't know if you can necessarily totally equate dukkha with the second arrow, but at least provisionally we might say that this second arrow is very strongly related to dukkha as a mark of conditioned existence. So we don't actually have to do that. And that second dart is not put in by an enlightened person. It's a mark of conditioned or unenlightened existence. And though much of our everyday life is actually really not that bad at all. We couldn't really say that God, I'm really suffering now. I'm eating quite a nice dinner here. What's the problem? But what is one of the things which dukkha is pointing at is that even our most you could say happy or pleasant experiences in the mundane world don't give us completely what we want. They're pleasant at their own level, but at the ultimate level, they don't fully satisfy us. So this is one of the levels of this lakshana we need to bear in mind, dukkha, is that the most deep desires of our heart aren't fulfilled by mundane existence. They're only fulfilled, and the tradition has it, by awakening. So this dukkha seems to be quite a lot to do with having expectations of what we will get out of life, out of people, from events and from things. So this may be to do with having sort of overblown positive expectations of what a relationship might bring, or having a new car will give us, or a new job, etc. And if we have expectations, and that will, over time, or maybe even straight away, may lead to some extra dukkha. And similarly, if we expect something to be really bad, which is often the case. We've got this thing we're sort of building ourselves up for, and it gets really, really bad. And in fact, doesn't actually turn out to be quite as bad as that. So that again, expectations in a negative, if you have really over negative expectation, that can really increase our sense of unsatisfactions. So we need to manage and eventually let go of expectations to reduce dukkha as much as we might. So we need to acknowledge that there is dukkha in life. There is disappointment, pain, fear, envy, not getting what we want, etc., blame, people not thinking well of us. So if we're going to reflect well on dukkha, we need to acknowledge that there's plenty of things which we don't particularly enjoy in life, but also we need to reflect that even our most favoured experiences, for me, those have been musical experiences, and one of my other favourite things is golf. And that's definitely plenty of dukkha in golf, I can tell you, even though it's Josh will know, he's a golfer as well. But yeah, even though it's quite pleasurable, it has quite a lot of dukkha built into it. And as a musician, you look forward to a performance, and yeah, you generally quite enjoyed it. But it could have been a lot better, couldn't it? Yeah, it could have been a lot better. So yeah, there's dukkha even in what one might regard as what one's favourite experiences. I found it really worthwhile. There's a teaching which now what was it? I can't remember exactly what the name of the teaching, but basically it's saying that dukkha is a defect of samsara, which I found quite an interesting and resonant idea, that dukkha is a defect of not being enlightened. So you don't have to look for something fundamentally wrong with you as a being. Dukkha is a defect of samsara, of not being enlightened. Anyway, that may resonate with you or it may not, but for me it was a very helpful idea that it's a defect of samsara. In a way, it's sort of inherent in the unawakened mind. So that's a bit about dukkha. So then we have the third lakshana of, well, it's in Pali and Sanskrit, it's known as either anatta or anatman, but I'm going to couch it as not self or no self. This is how it's sometimes talked about in English. So trying to give us some idea of what is really being pointed at here. And I alluded to it earlier, that it's saying that nothing has a totally enduring essence or selfhood. And that includes us, very importantly, that includes us. So there's nothing about us which is fixed, unchanging, separate, and something that's ultimately unaffected by conditions. So this is what we most likely mean by a self. It's something which is, in a sense, beyond change. We might think of it as something which is enduring and even has the experience we're having. Sometimes you might imagine things in those terms, that we're having this experience, as if something outside of the experience is having this experience. It doesn't really quite make sense, but we sometimes might have that kind of view. And the anatta and that one is saying, no, there's no fixed self in anything, including ourselves. So we might say that things are insubstantial in that sense. We might also think of anatta in terms of well, I just talked in terms of, you could say, no self, as if there's no fixed, unchanging self. But we could think in terms of not self, and that would mean, for example, that we would look on the body or the mind as not being ourself. And this might be a useful way of looking at things. So the body is impermanent. So if it's not a fixed thing, it can't be me. Because me, so we assume deep down, so it is said, we need lost my train here. Anyway, the body is not the body is impermanent, so it isn't fixed, so it can't be truly me. And similarly with the mind, we might strongly relate to our mind as being, oh, the mind is me. But if you look at your mind, what's going through your mind is changing from one moment to the next. So it's not fixed. So can that really be me? Doesn't really quite add up. And it might be a useful perspective to think in terms of, is something totally under our control? If it's truly me, or possibly mine, it's fully under our control. Is the body under our control? Is the mind under our control? Absolutely not. Doesn't make sense. So we're not a master. We're not a master of our mind or our body. So we can't really say that they are self, because that would require something to be something which is fully under our control and is fixed. So looking at a slightly different tack, you could say the whole Buddhist project is about undoing our attachment to this assumed selfhood. But we can only really do that once we have a solid and healthy sense of self. So you could quite reasonably say that you actually need to build up a solid and healthy sense of self before we can see through the self. So if we're not really very healthy in how we see ourselves, then we're actually not going to get too far in seeing through the self. That's just kind of an observation which has been found by Buddhist practitioners. Now, Sangharakshita talks in terms of seeing phenomena, talking about this lack of inherent selfhood as seeing phenomena in two ways. One is dynamically, so we would look at phenomena as being the result of supportive conditions. Take away those conditions and then the phenomena isn't there. So we look at it dynamically. And spatially, in the spatial terms, we could look at phenomena as being the sum of their parts. So we say the body, but the body's got loads of different parts. It's got leg, feet, hair, etc. So we talk about body, but in fact it's only really the sum of its parts. And it's also a conditioned process. It needs all the right conditions, air, for example, and life force for it to be a functioning body. So then, that's one way of looking at the body. Yes, rather than seeing the body as a fixed thing, it's dynamically, it's a result of supportive conditions, and it's also the sum of its different parts. So that's a bit on Lakshana of Anatta. And the verses we looked at earlier were saying that if we see the Lakshanas with wisdom, then we become weary of suffering. And another translation says something like, we turn away from suffering. So I wanted to say just a little bit about that. So important to say here that when we're talking about this weariness of suffering, or this turning away from suffering, this isn't to be seen as a miserable thing. This is much more a skillful mental state, which just happens to see things more clearly. So we could talk about a positive disenchantment with conditioned existence. This weariness is not a negative thing, it's a positive mental state, a positive disenchantment. And this also talks, this weariness of suffering also seems to talk, well at least we might draw out an increased sense of confidence and trust in the Dharma. If we're weary of suffering, in a way we sort of glimpse that there is more. There's one way of looking at it. So this is very much an emotional positive. There's an emotional positivity to this weariness, this this moving away from suffering. So we could talk about this turning away from suffering as referring to not going for refuge to mundane things in the same way as we did before. I remember when I was younger, I very much went to refuge to music. It was probably the height of my height. It was the best bits of my life. I went to refuge, but don't do it anything like the same way now. So there's some degree of turning away from suffering in that sense, turning away from refuges which don't truly deliver. And finally, then talking about the way to purity. So what seems to be said here is that to really understand conditioned existence, we need to understand these three actions deeply, understand the impermanence of conditioned existence, its unsatisfactoriness, and how things are devoid of inherent selfhood. So this is a path to, I think we can take it to think that this is very much part of the path to awakening. And as Sanghavakshita said, he said, the unconditioned is found in the depths of the conditioned, which is quite an interesting statement, that you explore the conditioned existence deeply. You find the unconditioned through meditating on the lakshanas. Through these gateways to liberation, these vimoksha mukkhas, we have access to profound insight, which can lead us to awakening.